Welcome to Save Us from Hell, a podcast about the United Nations. I am your co-host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch and founder of Global Dispatches.
And I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an author and an associate professor of international politics at Fordham University in New York, and I teach and do research and write about the United Nations.
So, Anjali, here we are, discussing in the middle of a whirlwind week in American politics. You know, it's likely, polls are tight, that President Trump will become President Trump again.
We're going to take an in-depth look at Project 2025 and what it says and what it means about the U.S.'s interactions with the UN.
I think that is a useful indicator of where, the movement that supports Trump wants to take U.S. policy in every aspect of U.S. policy in general, foreign policy in particular. And there is a section in Project 2025 about how America ought to approach international institutions, including the United Nations. So it's I think, worthwhile opportunity for us to just chat a little bit about what does Project 2025 say about how the U.S. should approach the United Nations. So what's your kind of top line takeaway on that, Anjali?
I'll read you the direct line, right? It says, the United States must return to treating international organizations as vehicles for promoting American interests or take steps to extract itself from those organizations, right? So the next administration must end blind support for international organizations. If the organization reflects U.S. interests and is effective at advancing them, the U.S. should support it. If it doesn't, the U.S. administration should not be nervous about withdrawing. And so, this point about withdrawal is big within Project 2025. The document says, the tough love approach to international organizations, that's their phrase, the tough love approach to international organizations, that the first Trump administration advanced is effective and served U.S. interests. And so they put on the table withholding every kind of support, including membership for organizations that are not serving U.S. interests. The other key feature of this sort of outline is a kind of effort to construct an alternative vision of human rights, what they call actual human rights, as opposed to the way that the sort of human rights treaties at the UN are traditionally interpreted and read.
So basically, the document makes the case for either leaving international institutions if they don't serve what they define as their American interests as they define them. So, first of all, I think it's fair to say that off the bat, the U.S. would probably withdraw from the World Health Organization, would do what typical Republican administrations do, like defund the UN Population Fund.
Yeah.
UNRWA is no expectation to be funding UNRWA.
Right.
But then you have more broadly this idea of, what tests will the new Trump administration impose upon these institutions to determine whether or not they are serving American interests, and if as they conceive American interests. And then if they fail those tests, they will withhold funding from these institutions. And a consequence of withholding funding from UN institutions tends to be losing your vote, which they would be happy with, and they would just withdraw. And these institutions rely on American funding, right?
Yeah.
It's the single biggest chunk of funding of most UN agencies come from the United States. So we can expect real harm and damage done to the UN agencies that the Trump administration seeks to withhold funding from, seeks to withdraw from. And, in general, they seem to, so the Project 2025 document doesn't say so explicitly, but they have this approach to the UN, which I've heard often described as a UN a la carte. Pay for the UN you want, and that's it. Everything else, we don't need to bother with.
And I think, in that vein, if we were thinking about what this document tells us, it has a very heavy emphasis on sovereignty, right? On sovereign rights. And so we can imagine a world in which the U.S. wants to retain its veto at the security, which obviously it will, right? Which precludes it from withdrawing from the UN system entirely, right?
Mhm.
But means that it's not going to be providing the funding and support other parts of the UN system need to function.
Yeah, like you would lose your vote at the General Assembly if you stopped funding the UN, but
Yeah,
your vote at the Security Council is baked into the UN Charter.
that's exactly right, right? It's safe, even if you decide there's no other part of the UN system that you want to deal with. And we can imagine a world in which many different kinds of ideologically inclined Trump insiders would want that seat at the Security Council to veto international projects that they are not on board with, or to veto multilateral projects that they're not on board with. And we can actually imagine a world, you know, Donald Trump has a reflexively pro Russian inclination. JD Vance has a reflexively anti Ukrainian um, disposition. And we can imagine a world in which the US unusually finds common security ground on issues at the Security Council with Russia, right? Now, we often say the Security Council works well when the five great powers can come together and agree on a certain vision of international peace and security. And it doesn't work well when they don't agree, right? When they can individually snarl up a Security Council. But we've actually never had a Security Council before where the US is inclined to vote with Russia more than it's inclined to vote with the UK and France.
Could we see a French or UK double veto against a US Russian initiative?
Yeah, it's hard to know, right?
It's a crazy new
Because
world out there.
it's a
If
crazy
there's
new
a yeah.
world. It's coming up on what 35 or 40 35 years that um the French and the UK have not used their veto by mutual agreement, right?
Hmm.
But we can imagine a world in which, it depends a lot on the kind of relationship that the Starmer government wants to cultivate
Mm-hmm.
with the Trump presidency. It is obviously an important relationship to the UK. I don't know, they've traditionally, even on issues where where they sort of diverge with the US, they have traditionally abstained in those votes rather than
Mm-hmm.
voting against the US or voting with the US if they disagree. And a lot depends on the outcome of the French elections.
So this potential like Russian American convergence at the Security Council, like I don't necessarily see it happening anytime soon. It's like
Right.
a potential out there.
Yeah.
However, the one area where I do see Russia and the United States under Donald Trump really working together behind the scenes
Mhm.
is in efforts to reframe and refocus what we consider to be human rights. And this
That's
is
right.
embedded directly in that Project 2025 document. The kind of conventional way that we understand human rights is not the way that sort of the kind of Christian conservative sovereignty focused MAGA kind of cohort approaches international human rights instruments. Can you just
Yeah.
explain what's going on in Project 2025 about how the Trump administration might seek to reframe human rights in the UN system?
Yeah. So the first pillar of their approach to international organizations is this emphasis on withdrawal when the institutions don't serve their interests or withholding of support. But the second pillar is constant pressure on these organizations to accept an alternate vision of rights and a moral vision that doesn't actually align with the foundational principles of these charters. So the Project 2025 outlook on rights sort of frames the idea of what they call what they call actual human rights, right? So this idea of, they're pushing towards something that's almost like a kind of originalism for human rights treaties, right? The actual text of Project 25 says international organizations should not be used to promote radical social policies as if they were human rights priorities. Doing so undermines actual human rights and weakens US credibility abroad. The next administration should use voice, influence, votes, and funding in international organizations to, to promote authentic human rights and respect for sovereignty based on the binding international obligations contained in the treaties that have been constitutionally ratified by the US. They go on to write, it must promote a strict text-based interpretation of many treaty obligations that does not consider human rights treaties as living instruments, both within the State Department and within international organizations that receive US funding, including by making respect for sovereignty and authentic human rights a litmus test of personnel decisions and election processes within international organizations.
So what does that mean in like real speak? Like they don't want to include gay rights as human rights. That's like number one. They don't want to have education policies that promote like a inclusive version of like being a citizen of the world. But like what like like how would you explain, like it's very jargony what they're writing, but this has like very specific meaning to people in the human rights community and also people in the advocacy community who have been advocating for a like keeping basically gay rights out of the UN human rights agenda.
Yeah, so that idea that basically what authentic human rights are involves a healthy respect for the culture of life, the family, and
Mm,
sovereignty, right? Those are all coded ways of thinking about traditional gender roles, about traditional sort of heterosexual marriage, and about, a lack of family planning, but also a lack of sort of like a progressive, inclusive understanding of human rights that adapts to encompass new norms about who deserves equal dignity and equal protection under the law, right?
mm,
And their efforts to sort of push that towards what the text actually says don't fit with the actual text of the agreements, right? That's not what the original human rights agreements say. But what they want to do is create that sort of set of alternative values as being the sort of baseline to be appointed to different UN posts,
mm,
or as being the baseline for, standing up a candidate for different kinds of organizations. That's what the language of a litmus test means, essentially, right? So
mm.
to say we have this alternative vision of what rights should be, we are willing to push hard on different organizations and agencies within the UN system to build a consensus for those rights. This vision of that they've advanced in Project 2025 is markedly different from the old bipartisan consensus on what constitutes like international human rights and international treaties, because the UN is specifically built in a liberal framework, right? When they talk about the sort of sticking to the strict text of human rights treaties and how they live in sort of US law and not interpreting them as living documents, what they're doing is actually erasing both the content of foundational American documents and the content of foundational UN documents, which reflect the same vision of international rights and the rights of individuals and politics as foundational UN documents, right? So the famous, like, UN, the former sort of Declaration of Independence, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with, certain certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? That is directly reflected in the UN Charter, where we talk, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights begins with the sort of recognition of the inherent dignity of the equal and unalienable rights of all members of the human family. And that the sort of foundation of these rights is freedom, justice, and peace in the world, right? But that everybody has a specific sort of um, equality under the law, equality before the law, and equality as a citizen, right? Now, traditional Republican administrations have often signed on whole scale to them because they represent the sort of liberal and democratic values of US foundational documents. But Project 2025 puts together a hierarchy of rights instead, right? The rights of the family and the rights of the group, those are the most important. The
Mm,
rights of the individual to have a progressively advancing um, spate of rights under
mm,
the sort of protection of the international organization, that doesn't exist there. And if we go back and listen to like George H.W. Bush, right? In his time, either as the US ambassador to the UN or as in time as the president of the US addressing the General Assembly right after the end of the Cold War, the traditional emphasis on the possibilities of peace through institutions and democratic representation, those animate conservative and neoconservative policy. And even if we think about the other conservative strain in US politics, the realist strain, right? That's one in which everyone is equal because everyone is equal in death, right? It's a very pessimistic vision of the world, but everybody has the same, derives the same rights from politics because everybody's going to die. And so what we do is we surrender our rights to the state, and the state gives some of them back, and they can take them anytime they want from us. But, we do that because we want the protection of the state. And that vision of conservatism, embodied by like a Henry Kissinger, basically treats international organizations as irrelevant, right? Like, okay, they exist, they're nice, they're kind of window dressing, you do them here and there, but at the end of the day, you can really do whatever you want. The Project 2025 vision is one in which you mobilize and weaponize international organizations to reflect what is a fundamentally um, different version of the way people exist in the world and their relationship to states and, to the international community, where they exist in hierarchy, naturally, socially, politically.
What's fascinating to me looking forward under a second Trump administration is that we can expect kind of unusual bedfellows. Because it is more conservative countries in the world that promote the kind of conservative vision of human rights. So you could foresee the Trump administration working with Russia to advance this, working with like Viktor Orban's Hungary, but also working with conservative Muslim countries around the world to advance this vision. And it'll just be like a different dynamic than we've seen for most of the last, couple decades at the UN in terms of like who's going to stand up for human rights. It's not going to be the United States under the Trump administration. In fact, they're going to band together with these other countries to advance this regressive vision.
So, taken together, this idea that you could withdraw from as much of the UN as you wanted to, or remove your funding, and this alternative vision of rights, these are very destabilizing things for the UN, in part because this vision of politics, right, as one in which there exist natural hierarchies and mass politics and potentially mass violence, and in which there doesn't exist the radical equality of all people under the law, right? That's something the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was explicitly written to counter, right? The sort of rise of 20th century fascist movements in Europe and the defeat of them, right, is what the sort of UN Charter was built to create. It is a document and an institution that outlaws aggressive warfare and that elevates the rights of the individuals from the violence of the state in an effort to create a more peaceful, more just world that is free from, what they call, a world in which the worst things have happened, right? And it's to prevent those worst things that the Charter is written, but it is therefore deeply like antithetical to this vision of politics where people are not equal and where sovereignty is a mobilizational tool for aggressive war.
One last point I wanted to discuss with you is about appointments that the second Trump administration might make to the United Nations. Now, as we've discussed on this podcast before, there's like a convention in the UN system that an American gets to head certain posts at the UN. There are certain people who will be destined to leave their job, chief among them, Cindy McCain. She was an ardent critic of Trump's, supported Joe Biden for president, became the U.S. ambassador to like the food agencies, and is now the head of the World Food Program. She'd be gone. No way she'll get her calls answered. On the flip side, the kinds of people that Trump appointed to UN posts or sought to appoint to UN posts in the first administration were like, generally speaking, totally out of line and out of whack with like the vibe of the UN. You had this really interesting incident in which Trump appointed a guy named Ken Isaacs, who was the head of Samaritan's Purse, a kind of Christian humanitarian organization,
Yeah.
who was going to be appointed the head of the International Organization for Migration. And that's like typically a U.S. post. It's only
Yeah.
Americans have ever headed the International Organization for Migration. So in normal circumstances, an American president nominates, and like the organizing body of the IOM just rubber stamps. But in this case, it turns out Ken Isaacs had a lot of Islamic phobic and a lot of racist stuff that he'd written publicly on social media that was dug up, and these Islamic phobic and racist kind of remarks led to the fact that there is no longer an American heading the
Yeah.
IOM today. Similarly, not the UN directly, but you had David Malpass, who was
Mhm.
appointed head of the World Bank under the Trump administration, who was like a climate denier, which is really odd in the sense that like the World Bank is intended to focus on climate change, and he was
Yeah.
kind of hounded out of his job eventually. But you can foresee if the U.S. does not leave these organizations that Trump will try to install like kind of extremists to head some of these organizations, because that's kind of what happened before.
Yeah, I think that's right. Specifically because, the Project 2025 document says that this is an effort, right? Like you want to place your loyalists and your sort of ideological compatriots in these posts. And so, what that would mean for the confirmation processes for these posts, I don't really know. That would depend on a whole bunch of other factors, right? But it does seem likely that the next round of appointees would be even more out of step with the sort of traditional attitudes and cultures at the UN.
Now, the one potential saving grace here is a name that Donald Trump has floated before as someone he would like to serve as ambassador to the United Nations, his daughter Ivanka Trump. Now, it is like I would say good odds,
Hmm.
because he's mentioned her in the context of wanting her to be his
Yeah.
ambassador to the UN, that Ivanka Trump is
Hmm.
the United States ambassador to the United Nations.
Yeah,
And honestly, if that's the case, that could be like the best case outcome
that's right.
for the UN, because it reduces the likelihood that
Yeah.
the US tries to pull out of the UN altogether.
Yeah.
Ivanka obviously has a lot of sway with her father, would want to
Hmm.
keep and maintain the
Yeah.
UN's like relevance in order to like
Hmm.
maintain her own like bureaucratic relevance.
Yeah.
So I would imagine that this is like the outcome that those of us, and I include
Yeah.
myself here,
Yeah.
who want to foment a constructive relationship between the United States and the United Nations,
Yeah.
believes would be probably like the best case outcome here.
It's bonkers, isn't it? Right? Because the alternative to like Ivanka Trump would be someone who made John Bolton look like a kitten, right? The sort of
That would be Rick
way,
Grinnell, his John Bolton's old
yeah,
spokesperson, who I used to interact with back in the day when Bolton was the U.S. ambassador.
yeah, a guy who's deeply hostile to the goals of the UN and to the
Yeah,
sort of like culture of the UN. And we can imagine that, many of the hardcore loyalists that he might pull on would exist in this space. But Ivanka Trump is it seems strange to say she's not a hardcore ideological loyalist because she's his daughter, but she's
yeah,
not, right? Like,
yeah,
and in that sense, as you say, the personal relationship that she has with Trump might be a remarkable preservation move for people
yeah,
at the UN, particularly if Antonio Guterres is willing to do what he did in the first term, which is devote a lot of diplomatic capital to making her and her father feel important
yeah,
and to making her and her father feel like, their role at the UN is indispensable, which quite frankly it is,
yeah,
unfortunately, right? The way the UN is structured makes US support for the UN indispensable to its work.
yeah,
And, you know, she has a kind of diplomatic capability that would sit well at the UN, right?
yeah,
For people considering the alternative. Also, if you're listening to this, and I don't think you are, but Ivanka, you could stay in New York.
yeah.
Like you could do a good job from where you already live. Um, And so, in that sense, do we want people's daughters to serve as key ambassadors? No, it's not the way a healthy democracy should work, right? But when we consider the alternative to, who else might sit in that seat and try to tear apart the fabric of contemporary multilateralism, she looks pretty good.
It looks pretty good.
Yeah.